there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hi, this is Matthew, and welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. In this episode, we bring you an interview with Gary Barkhuizen. Gary is professor and current head of school in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Gary has co-authored books including Analysing Learning Language and Second Language Identity in Narratives of Study Abroad, and edited books including Reflections on Language Teacher Identity Research, and that title is a topic featured in the following interview. Gary's research interests include language teacher education, teacher identity, study abroad, and studies that use narrative inquiry and other qualitative methodologies. Rob and Matt recorded this interview in February at New York University's School of Professional Studies in Tokyo, before Gary gave a presentation for JALT's Tokyo chapter. We'd like to thank the staff at the school for allowing us to use their facilities to record this interview, and for JALT Tokyo's cooperation.
Okay, so we're sitting here with Gary Barkhuizen. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
So the first thing we'd like to talk about, maybe the main thing we'd like to talk about, is language teacher identity. Of course, that's a big area. So perhaps just to begin with, could you talk a little bit about or about how you became interested in language teacher identity and how that was related to your own professional experiences?
Yeah, I guess as a practicing teacher, one is always interested in who one is and how one operates, and what our place is in the field of language teaching, what our place is in our schools and our universities, and even sort of more broadly in relation to ministries of education and assessment criteria and curriculum. There's so much going on in our field, and I think it's important that we try to figure out where we fit into all of that, and what if we can have any sort of effect on all of those sort of complex contexts that we live and work in. So I guess it's something that's sort of ongoing. I've always wondered where I fit in as a language teacher, and right at the beginning of my career, whether I was a genuine teacher or not, and what a genuine language teacher is. So there were all these questions, and I think everyone has them, about how do we fit into this whole profession, the whole career, the whole industry in a way. But I hadn't actually researched identity as such. I had done some work on language learner identity, and discovered there how absolutely complex it is in the process of language learning. But some time ago, I was teaching a course at the University of Auckland on sociolinguistics in language education. And one of the pre-service teachers in the course was really interesting in what was required for that course was for the teachers to write a series of narratives, and then to analyze those as part of an assignment. And I was really interested in the way she was conceptualizing herself as a pre-service teacher and imagining herself as a practicing teacher in the future. So I started to explore with her in a collaborative sort of action research type project how she was developing as a teacher, and how she saw her own identity as a teacher. And so that particular sort of narrative project that we started went on for some years. So more and more I've been exploring the literature on language teacher identity, and trying to become familiar with that literature as I work with teachers and as I reflect on my own teaching and my own life as a researcher. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think just to sort of summarize it, one has to do with trying to make sense of who we are in our teaching worlds, and the other part of it has to do with that particular project that I got involved in and worked on in some detail over a number of years with this one particular teacher. So that's more or less where it started for me as a researcher.
Right.
And you've recently edited a book titled Reflections on Language Teacher Identity Research. And in your introduction to the book, you begin by explaining how you've, like you said before, you've kind of grappled with what LTI is. And that in attempting to theorize it, things become murky. And instead you propose a composite conceptualization. I'm just wondering if you can talk about some of these components.
Okay, so the composite conceptualization is a little murky itself, to be honest, but where it came from was I did a thematic analysis of all the chapters in the book, 40-odd chapters, where all the authors discussed their own conceptions of how they saw language teacher identity within their areas of expertise, from second language writing to teacher education to teacher research and so on. So I did an analysis of all of their ideas about how they see language teacher identity. And then what I tried to do was to put all those ideas together into one, what I called a composite conceptualization of language teacher identity. I must say right at the start that this is not a particular definition of LTI. It's also not a theory of LTI. It's simply a composite summary of all of these ideas about language teacher education, about language teacher identity. Just to support that conceptualization, in all my reading on language teacher identity, I feel that everything I read somehow fits with this conceptualization. And it's extremely inclusive. It includes everything to the point where it might even be meaningless to a certain extent. But some of the major components are that it relates to identity inside of us or within us, our cognitive aspects of identity, our own reflexive identities, but also our identities outside of us as we interact with people, our learners and teachers, administrators, and so on. And also by outside, I mean our interactions with materials and objects and spaces and places. So there's the sort of interaction with people and materials on if you're looking at sort of external definitions or interactive definitions, but also very much inside, how we see ourselves and how we make sense of ourselves. So some other parts of that conceptualization have to do with how our identities, say identities in plural because they are multiple. We have a number of different identities as teachers. How sometimes they are contested both by ourselves, where the identities we see ourselves having are sometimes in conflict, but also sometimes our identities may be in conflict with how others see us. Then maybe our learners or other teachers, and so on. So there's often this contestation, but there's also sometimes harmony. So sometimes our work is valued and appreciated, and we see ourselves doing a good job. So there's that aspect to it. And some of these identities are foregrounded, sometimes they're backgrounded. So everything's very fluid when it comes to looking at teacher identity. We aren't always the same all the time in all contexts. So they're forever changing, both in the short term, in any social interaction, but also in the longer term, sort of over time. So I think those are the main aspects of that rather complex composite conceptualization.
You were talking there about outside influences. Maybe to follow on that theme a little bit. In answering the first question, you spoke about ELT as a profession and also as an industry.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a very big, thorny question.
Yes.
But how do you think that those kinds of outside influences, the way that the profession is perceived perhaps, influences the way that teachers see themselves and conceive of their own identity?
Yeah, so I like to think of, from a narrative perspective, that we work as teachers within various scales of context, right? So some work's been done by the Douglas Fir Group in an article that was published in Modern Language Journal, where they also look at this idea of these expanding scales of context. And in these expanding scales of context, you get at the center the individual teacher working with other teachers. Then as you move out, these teachers operate in institutions and schools and universities. And then even further out, you look at ministries of education and big curriculum debates, big assessment debates, ideologies that influence the way that we work. So it's within this large set of social structures that we operate, and are sometimes constrained by those social structures in terms of what we can do. But at the same time, we also have agency within those structures to a certain extent. There's certain things we can do in our teaching to perhaps bring about change, either on a small scale or even on a more sort of macro scale. That's quite difficult to do if we don't reflect on who we are and we don't reflect on our practice. So I think that's where identity is important in relation to that question. So through learning who we are and what we do and understanding the context in which we do our work, it's much more possible than to perhaps bring about change.
Right.
In our first question to you, you talked about your learner and the way that she used her narrative to describe herself.
Yeah.
What have been like the common themes that you found from your students when they describe themselves as teachers, for example?
Yeah, I guess it depends at what stage of their careers that they're at. So often pre-service teachers are very concerned about actual practice, about what they're going to do in the classroom. So when they describe themselves, they often talk about the materials they're going to use, and about their learners, about what they do right and what they do wrong. But as one gains more experience, the reflections on identity take a sort of broader meaning, looking at oneself within the industry. And just getting back to your earlier question, Rob, sort of questioning some of their practice that they may be constrained to do within particular professions or particular industries. Those are, as you said, really, really big questions. So as one gets experience, I think there goes with it a certain amount of confidence that enables people through experience to try and make those changes. So the identities change sort of longer term as being seen as a sort of practitioner, when we're always a practitioner, right? I mean, all the way through. But a practitioner who may be enabled to do different things within those constraining structures that I was talking about earlier.
Right.
Talking about kind of constraints, do you think that there are any prevailing beliefs within the profession that do kind of constrain the way that teachers view themselves?
Again, that's a question that can be answered very differently in very different contexts.
Right.
I supervise a number of PhD students, and one of my students recently finished an excellent study where he worked in northwest Pakistan in rural schools, rural primary schools, and the questions he was asking the teachers, often one teacher in one school teaching multiple grades. So the type of questions you would ask that teacher about identity and about their role within the profession would be very different to the type of questions and the type of answers you'd get from teachers working at a university here in Japan, for example. I mean, it sounds like a very obvious example, but just to consider your question, it depends. It depends on what the context is. It depends on the resources that people have. It depends on their investment in teaching, why they're in teaching in the first place. Some people have the luxury of being in teaching for certain reasons, whereas others may not have the luxury. They may be working extremely hard to support large families, and so being a teacher in that sense and requiring people like that, for example, to be involved in conference attendance and research publications, it just doesn't make sense. Whereas for others, it would be more or less expected or required. So there's a very broad scale of what being a teacher is, and a lot of it has to do with these ideological contexts in which they operate.
Right. Yeah, I think the contextual issue is very interesting. We were talking about this before the interview, actually, but in Japan we have kind of our group, I guess, of people who work in the university area, and we're very invested in professional development and that kind of thing. But we also have lots of friends who work in the private language schools or the high schools. And it seems there's kind of a tension or a mistrust between teachers, even in terms of those two different groups, a bit of conflict.
Yeah, we found some resistance. I guess we're doing things that you kind of describe as extended professionalism.
Yes.
And we feel there's some resistance to that, to people that could be perceived as not doing that. And do you think that has anything to do with notions of what's expected of language teachers and what's not expected of language teachers from those on the outside, perhaps?
Yeah,
in
I think
different
so.
contexts, of course.
I think absolutely, and not only those on the outside, but those in the inside who have more power, who make decisions about what's required of teachers in particular institutions or in particular regional contexts even. I know some contexts, such as some schools in China, for example, where even at primary school, some sort of research is a requirement in certain schools for those schools to achieve a particular status, and so on. So there's a whole lot of variables, if you want to call them that, that need to be taken into account to answer those questions. But I think you're right. I think there is a certain amount of distrust between those who are striving for sort of something over and above what the required practice would be, or an expected practice would be, and those who are, not. But again, their personal constraints and their contextual constraints, which allow, teachers to be involved in those professional activities. And there's some teachers who just don't want to. They're not motivated. They're in a job. They need to get money to look after themselves and their families and their community, and that's it. And then requiring anything in addition to that would just not be fair on them, and they've got their own very good reasons for that.
But I guess that would still be a part of their identity, though.
Oh, absolutely,
Well,
it is.
you could still describe that as being a part of how they kind of associate their life and their work.
Yeah. Because part of the identity is how you perceive the teacher role. What the function of the teacher is, and in different places, how that role is perceived is very different. There's a different status assigned to teachers in different places. And though that assigned status comes from the community, comes from society generally, and when you work within those different situations, you take on that status that's assigned by the external community, whatever.
Of course, identity is very important to the teacher themselves. But how does an understanding, I guess, of your own teacher identity affect, how does it kind of extend out into the world, for example, into the world of the classroom?
Yeah, interesting that I was at a conference in Colombia, in South America, and I was talking about teacher identity. And I got a question from one of the teachers who was in the audience, not during the presentation, but afterwards. He came to see me, and he asked me that question. He said, "What's the significance of teacher identity for me as a teacher? What's it got to do with my practice?" So I said, "Well, tell me about some of the teachers who work in your school." He said, "Well, there's this other English teacher," he said, "who's a very good musician. So he always, in his language classes, will play music and bring his musical instruments, and there's always music." He said, I would never do that." He said, I think it's wrong." I said, "Well, you know what you're doing now? You actually are articulating yourself as a teacher and what you do and don't do in the classroom, and you've just told me a story about another teacher who does things in his classroom in a certain way because of how he sees himself as a teacher. So I think there's a very strong connection. There's obviously a strong connection between our identities and our practice, and what we do in the classroom relates very closely to who we are as a teacher and how we see ourselves as teachers. And also, in order to understand what we do in the classroom better, I think it's better to try and understand who we are as teachers. So they work very much together. Right. If we know what's going on in our classrooms, if we know who our learners are, we're able to be better teachers. And I think one way of achieving that is to know who we are as teachers.
Yeah, I guess if you want to make changes, for example, then you have to understand what you're currently doing and why you're doing it.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Something for me personally, I've just finished 4 years working on a big program where there's been 45 of us all teaching the same unified curriculum, and over those 4 years I've become more and more personally detached from the classroom, in that I don't share so much about my life with the students, I've tend to stepped away from kind of a bit of personal investment in the class, with still being professional, of course.
Yes,
but
of course.
I'm just wondering if one of the things I'd like to do next year is to kind of bring my identity back into the classroom. And I'm sure it's already there for the students to see, but I kind of want to make it a bit more kind of explicit or conscious in myself. Do you think that would have any impact on my connection with the class or the students' connections with me, for example?
Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced it will. How you, just as I was saying earlier, how you see yourself and how you understand yourself is completely connected with what happens in the classroom. So it sounds like you're making a sort of conscious change here in the way you work, in the way you negotiate your multiple teacher identities, which include the professional development and inside the classroom, outside the classroom. It sounds like you're making a decision to me that from next year you will change focus again to much more what you do inside the classroom and developing that side of your teaching. I'm going through exactly the same thing now, because I've been head of a fairly large school for the past 5 years now, and my term is coming to an end, which I'm very excited about. But that also means that I'll be stepping up the amount of in-classroom teaching that I do, because that was reduced over the years as I was head of school. And I'm actually looking quite forward to that, because I have maintained my classroom teaching at university, but it's been quite limited. And often it hasn't been the priority every day. But now that these head of school duties, that's one of my identities as a teacher, right, is my administrative identity, which has been very much foregrounded over the past few years, will recede into the background. And my in-classroom instructor identity will be much more foregrounded, which I'm looking really forward to. I'll be able to invest more time in the planning of my teaching and the assessment and so on. So I think it's a similar story to yours in a way.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that my students are going to notice it, and then they're going to work with me in the sort of co-construction, I guess, of my developing identity, like it will with yours, because it's not, identity isn't something you bring into the classroom and it determines what you do there, but the identity is being articulated and negotiated in the classroom with the learners at the same time, and that's why it's always changing.
So generally in society, I think in kind of the last sort of decade or so, I think people are becoming more open about how they can identify, perhaps, for example, gender descriptions. People are becoming more open, and society is becoming more open to that. So do you think the same could be said about teacher identities, that they're becoming a little bit more open? So, for example, at the moment there are some debates about the role of teachers doing research, exploratory practice. There was a recent article by Peter Majesh, I think, about the kind of the disconnect between teachers and researchers, and yeah, so you know, the idea that you have some people identify as teachers and some people identify as researchers, and there's a line between the two. Do you think that there's more fluidity these days?
Absolutely, I think there is. I think it's I think the message that has come through our conversation so far is that our identities are not only fluid, but they're always changing. And I think there are far more expectations now of what teachers do in many contexts around the world. If we just see what's happening in some parts of the world with political movements and so on, there's certain requirements for what teachers are expected to do. There's certain levels of accountability for teachers. There's a lot of measurement, in a sense, of what we do and how our learners learn or don't learn. And so times are changing, certainly, in the way we work in our institutions and the way our institutions operate in a sort of broader society. So I think it's both an opportunity and there's also very much a challenge there, because I think some of the constraints that teachers are experiencing, and particularly language teachers in various parts of the world are quite severe, and they need to be challenged. And I don't have the answers to that, but you see fewer people actually learning languages nowadays in some contexts. And what do we do about that? We can't simply close down departments in universities and schools. That's not the way to go. But what's the answer to that? So these are some of the things that challenge our own identities as teachers, because we may be required to take on different types of work, or we may be required to stop certain type of practices that we are used to and may even see ourselves as good at. So I think, yes, to answer your question, that things are changing. There's fluidity and some sort of adaptability of not only our practices but our identities that relate to those practices as well.
Yeah, I think there was a resonance there between what you were speaking about before, Matt. So the idea of a program that was very, very standardized, and here in Japan there seems to be a push, especially in universities and so on, to standardize language teaching, to remove the teacher's individual control over the class.
Agency, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess that kind of takes the teacher's identity out of the equation a little bit.
What happens? You get ascribed or assigned a different identity, not one that you negotiated yourself necessarily, but it's one that's been assigned to you. In those situations, you just end up being unhappy. And talking about unhappy, emotions are extremely intricately connected to who we are and identity. And there's a lot of expressions of stress and people being depressed and being overworked and burnt out and all those sort of negative emotions that are sort of socially constructed, because it's things that we do with other people in the institutions that we work in, just like the example that you gave. So it makes for unhappy teachers, and unhappy teachers don't teach well.
Yeah, they're disconnected from what they're doing.
They disconnect, or they simply leave the profession, which if they had been good, committed teachers, is very sad, because it's a big loss. And then they may be replaced by people who actually buy into the type of regime that you're talking about, and then it has a larger effect on changes in education.
Right.
Perhaps just one final question. Obviously, we want our listeners to be happy teachers, but we also want them to take something kind of practical away from this interview. So, how could studies in learner-teacher identity be practically put into practice by teachers? Or another one of your areas is narrative inquiry. How could this be a good kind of vehicle for studying about learner identity, or teacher identity, I should say, as well?
Yeah, so just understanding your question, you may be talking about teachers who do research or reflective practice in order to understand themselves and their and their context, or so if that's one way. And then also another way of looking at it is for researchers to work with teachers to achieve those same sort of aims.
Yeah. That's right.
So you mentioned narrative. I firmly believe that through stories we are able to make sense of what we do in classrooms. So finding opportunities within an action research design or within an exploratory practice design to make use of stories that are there, and that are being constructed all the time. There are many other non-narrative ways of doing it, but since you did mention narrative, ways of looking at how stories are generated, what sort of stories are generated, and what these stories are saying, which, as I said, are already there in what teachers are doing. You don't need to design an interview schedule or a questionnaire or have any particular research methods. It's just to tap into what's already being discussed and what's already evident with teachers. But if teachers actually do get involved in action research projects or exploratory practice, then more systematically they can use narratives, either through writing narratives or generating narratives in some way, or to use those that already exist in classroom life. And there's a lot of stories that are forever being told and listened to and created in classrooms, but just tapping into those in order to understand what's happening.
Yeah, I see. Okay, well, perhaps we'll leave it there. But thank you very much for your time today, Gary. It's been very interesting.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we hope you enjoyed that interview with Gary Barkhuizen. We'd like to thank Gary once again for sitting down with Rob and Matt and chatting with them. Let's see, if you want to get in touch with us, our email address is TEFLology@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at TEFLology. We have a Facebook page that you can find. Our website is TEFLology-podcast.com. You can find all of our episodes, listen to them straight from the website. We have a book, Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers. It's an ebook. It's available on Amazon as a Kindle book. And there's a bunch of different ways to listen to us besides the usual podcast ways through iTunes. So we also have a YouTube page. You can listen to all the episodes there. We're on Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and all the usual places. If you like what you hear, or if you have any comments or questions or suggestions, Facebook is a good place for that. Twitter is a good place, and or rate and review the podcast on iTunes. That would be great. Okay, thank you once again for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.